By the Grace! A good YA novel. Hey there everyone, Afrodo Reviews here, bringing you another book to decide. Is that worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? So let's decide. Graceling is a young adult fantasy novel written by Kristen Kishore. I think that's how you say her last name, but I'm not sure. And published on October 1st, 2008. It's the first published book in what is known as the Graceling Realm series. Although I don't know if that's a fan dubbing or that's an official dubbing. I couldn't find much either way. But this book was followed in publication by a prequel known as Fire, and then later on a sequel known as Bitter Blue. The book itself doesn't have any awards to its name that I could find. However, it did earn a place on Publisher Weekly's top 10 books of 2008, or Publisher Weekly's best books of 2008. Apart from that, all I can really say is that the book received a lot of good press about the time it was released, or about the time it was published, as my report card will show. Now, let's start this review where we always start. The cover. Now, the cover for this book is a little bland. Now, for those of you who've read a lot of fantasy, you know that when it comes to fantasy novels, this book's cover is very stereotypical, I guess, or common. Basically, the idea of a weapon sitting on the foreground while the background is sort of a white and cool color mix, and that's pretty much all the cover is. It's actually... this book got me thinking about how common that was, and even on my own shelf, I have at least 4 or 5 books that have this exact cover, just with a different weapon and a different color. Nothing about this tells you anything about the book. It's not terrible, but it's definitely not something that represents what's inside the book at all. Now, the back is at least fairly decent. They changed the color scheme to more of a reddish, brick reddish, while giving you a synopsis on the book. Apart from that, yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say on the cover. Again, there's not much to say about it because it is just a standard fantasy cover. So, we'll move on. Let's go to the synopsis. Now, for those of you who've been watching my channel, you know that I didn't quite read the back of the book like I normally do. Instead, I sacrificed this month's TBR to do a New Year's resolution video, and I was also debating if I was even going to keep my TBR videos in the future. But anyways, in light of that, I'll try to be a bit more descriptive of what this book is actually about. This book follows Katza, a young woman in the land of the Graced. I forget what the world is called. I don't think I ever saw. The land of the Graced, the world of this book. She is what is known as a Graced. Now, Graced in this world are a group of people that are born with extraordinary abilities. This can range anywhere from as extraordinary as reading someone's mind, to you can climb a tree really good, to you're literally just the Purple Man from Marvel. Not FNAF, Marvel.
All right, yes! That was absolutely tremendous. I thought I was good.
Now, Katka herself is a grace that has been given the gift of killing. And because of that, she's been used by her uncle as a enforcer, more or less. He basically sends her after people who get on his bad side to make a clear point that, no, I'm in charge. During that time, she decided that she doesn't like hurting people, so she starts her own little counter-organization known as the Council. And they do their best to help people. Now, the Council, this book starts with the Council rescuing the grandfather of another country's king, the country in question being called Lynid. I think it's called Lynid or Lynid. But there's a lot of questions surrounding the kidnapping. The first of which being, who had him kidnapped. They can't seem to find an agreement, so Katsuka ends up teaming up with Po, the grandson of this man who was kidnapped, and the two of them delve deeper into this, finding stuff they weren't quite prepared for. And that's where I'm going to leave off, because that's where I'm going to have to start getting into spoilers territory to tell you more about this. I actually probably told you more than normal. To move on, let's get into the review. Simply put, I like this book. But like I said, as my opening suggested, I thought this book was very good. Not as great as I was hoping, but again, for a young adult fantasy novel, this book is good. The chemistry between Katsuka and Po is actually pretty decent. A lot of the times in these young adult novels, the chemistry between characters is fairly non-existent. The main romantic lead is just kind of jammed together because that's what the author wants, and very rarely does it actually feel like they would have ended up together naturally otherwise. Whereas this, I completely believe that Katsuka and Po end up in a relationship together. The antagonist also presents a fairly unique challenge, as opposed to a standard we just need to beat him up real bad, or, he just holds a lot of power. So there was also that, and there was some nice bittersweet irony behind the death of the antagonist that I think was great, even though the book feels the need to spell it out for me why it was ironic. To go off on that point right there, that's one of the biggest issues about this book. It's about as subtle as a sledgehammer to the face. Yeah. So I'm going to preface this really big complaint I have about this book with a very simple disclaimer. This is a young adult book, and this is one of the young adult books aimed specifically more towards women than me. So obviously I'm very outside of the target demographic. In addition to the fact that it's, at this point, 15 years old. Damn. So, to some merit, please take my complaints with a grain of salt, because again, I'm not in the target demographic, and this probably won't seem as out there for the people who this book is aimed at, but it is something I very much noticed while reading myself. Yeah, but as I said, this book lacks any form of subtlety. And I genuinely mean that. For one, let's put it this way. The book has a very strong feminist agenda, and that's not something that's not a complaint on the book. I don't care if it's feminist agenda or not. But when I say it lacks subtlety about this, it's not so much that the book is feminist and tries to present that within the themes of the story. I mean, the book is feminist, so our main character Katsuka hates everything that marks femininity. But she hates dresses. She hates the fact that her hair is long. She hates the very concept of marriage. It's just, yes, before you comment anything, I completely understand that within the book itself, Katsuka has a reason to dislike these things, because these are the things that her uncle Randa, the king that had used her as his enforcer, basically used in his court to control her. And while that does further my point of how unsubtle it is because the feminine visages that she could don are being used to control her, it's just that that's the only aspect of femininity that we're really shown. We're not really given another character, as far to my knowledge, at least it didn't stand out very well, who likes all these girly things, but is also seen as a independent woman. Because there's no reason you can't be a feminist, but also like feminine things. And it's not just themes of the story. Again, this isn't just me hyper-focusing on one thing. This isn't just themes of the story. It also involves characters. It also involves plot twists. It also involves the narrative twists about the world. It also involves the world building. Fortunately, going into detail about an even more clear example is going to have spoilers. So, I'm going to put a time code down below. If you want to go on this book completely blind with no spoilers, skip to this time below and continue with the review. I'm going to give you guys a couple seconds to do that. But this The spoilers are specifically in regards to Katza and her abilities. Okay, so everyone who skipped ahead has already skipped ahead. Now, for most of the book, we are told that Katza's grace is the art of killing. In that her grace gives her basically tunes her body and her perception to be the perfect killer. At least, so we're told. However, after we meet Poe and he presents himself as a fighting grace, i.e. someone who has a great strength in fighting, but, not killing like Katza, he reveals that no, his grace isn't actually fighting, he has a awareness grace, so to speak. I think that's what they called it. But his grace is that he's hyper aware of his environment, sort of like Daredevil, and that's a joke for people who's actually read the book. He can read the minds of people only when it directly relates to him as a person and what they feel about him. Now that's all and good. It's an interesting twist, how to make grace as a power more interesting by making it, it's not what you think it is at first. However, before you're even halfway through the book, I would honestly be shocked if you didn't figure out what Katza's grace is. Because Katza, the book makes it super clear that her grace is survival. Repeated attention is brought to the fact that, 1, she can travel at high speeds at all times without getting tired, can go for several days without feeling the effects of tiredness. When she does lay down to go to sleep, she basically stays awake until she decides, okay, go to sleep. And that's basically how it goes. Plus, the time when her power did spring up, it was solely in defense of herself from a lecherous noble. And it's just one of those, it's so clear what her grace actually is, that when the big reveal finally happens, it's not it's more of a, well, yeah, what else could it have been? To round off, I think the reason it's like that is because this book lacks any form of complexity or nuance to it. Bad guys are bad because they're bad. Good guys are good because they're good. There's no complexity within the story, which is fine, but some of the subjects and events that take place within the story would have very much been better with some complexity added. Another thing that suffers because of this lack of complexity is the world building. The setting of this world is basically the most generic version of medieval European fantasy that you can get. You're given the names of the countries and you're given the kings and what they're like, and that's about it. Even now, as I'm sitting here trying to think about it, apart from Leonid, who did maybe 2 things I can tell you about that, I can't tell you a thing about this world. I can't tell you any of the customs of the world. I can't tell you any myths of the world. I can't tell you any of the religions in the world. I can't tell you why they view grace the way they do, because the world takes a very mutants from Marvel or mages from Dragon Age approach. People don't like the grace because they have powers, and that's about the extent of why people don't like grace. They're the outcast people, but in both of the cases I just mentioned, there's more to why people don't like mutants or don't like mages than just they're mutants or they're mages. To focus on the Dragon Age example, because that's the more relevant one being fantasy, mages in Dragon Age are not only gifted with extreme magical power, but their religion, the Chantry, has a very strong mythology with its mythical hero Andraste, who gathered up and created the circles where all mages are kept because magic should serve man, not rule over him. Plus, in addition to that, mages are highly susceptible to being possessed by demons, which when this happens, even if they're as young as an 8-year-old kid, skyrockets their power and turns them into such a force of malevolent energy that they can summon literally armies of undead to attack a countryside. So there's a lot of although the oppression that happens to the mages within that world is often portrayed as very negative, you can at least understand why the people of that world have come to fear mages the way they do. Whereas in this world, I don't really get why anyone would like look at a Grace that can climb a tree really good and think, Satan child. It's just, this is a minor complaint as much as I'm focusing on it, because yeah, people don't like things that are different from them. I just feel that there should have been slightly more effort put into why people don't like Grace. Apart from the ones like Katza, who they believe is killing. But like I said, apart from some minor stuff from Leonid, and that's purely through the character Poe, I can't tell you a thing about this world in just how it is. So all in all, I would give this book a 6 out of 10. Now, stop typing. I know fans of this book are probably going to see this as a crime against this book. And personally, I very heavily debated this rating. Even now, as I record this, I'm debating in my mind whether or not it deserves a 6 or it should have been a 7. Ultimately, I did go with 6 because although personally on a pure enjoyment scale, I would probably rate it a 7. The 6 is because it does fumble some stuff that is objectively bad. Again, the world itself isn't fleshed out in the slightest, and the book has no sense of subtlety or nuance to it at all. And while I did overall like this book and would recommend it, I don't think I can justify to myself giving it a 7 for the purposes of this rating. But then comes the question. Does it deserve Mount Doom? Now, like I said, I actually enjoyed this book, and my rating of 6 out of 10 is not based on my personal enjoyment. In fact, I would actually recommend this book to anyone looking for can't say that on YouTube anymore, a kick-butt female protagonist in a fantasy setting, or if you want to read a YA novel that I feel has some decent chemistry between the main leads. And even what this book does do to flesh out its world is interesting enough that I would recommend, there's some cool to it. You should pick up this book and read it if you're looking for a YA fantasy novel. Just be warned that this book is more of a dark fantasy, and there will be some uncomfortable subjects in there if you're worried about that. But other than that, it's pretty good. Reading all these fantasy stories has got me wondering what's going on in the future. What's going on in the real world? It's time to tune into my favorite station on the radio and check out Radio Apocalypse. Sorry guys, I had an ebook for this. I'll probably put it right there. But with that being said, just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having, even the bad ones.